Hello and good evening, everyone. My name is Sam Ellis, and I'm the president of the Chicago chapter of the Federalist Society. Tonight, I have the distinct honor to sit down with two distinguished guests, Liberman Otis and David M. McIntosh, to celebrate 40 wonderful years of the Federalist Society through the 40 for 40 series brought to you by the Student Division of the Federalist Society. Now, our two guests do not need an introduction, but I'm going to do my best to give them each one. Lee Otis is the Senior Vice President and Faculty Division Director of the Federalist Society. She also serves as an adjunct professor at Georgetown University Law Center, is a member of the American Law Institute, a senior fellow of the Administrative Conference, and as a co-chair of the National Constitution's Coalition of Freedom Advisory Board. Lee has served in many public service roles throughout her legal career as a special assistant and associate deputy attorney general for the U.S. Department of Justice, as an associate counsel to President George H.W. Bush, and a law clerk to Associate Justice Antonin Scalia. Lee received her BA from Yale College and her JD from the University of Chicago Law School. We are also honored to be joined by David M. McIntosh, the president of the Club for Growth, which is the leading advocate for economic liberty. David represented Indiana's 2nd Congressional District in the United States Congress from 1995 to 2001. During the Reagan administration, David served as a special assistant to Attorney General Edwin Meese III and as a special assistant to President Reagan for domestic affairs. During the first Bush administration, he served as an executive director for the President's Council on Competitiveness and assistant to the vice president. David also served as a partner at Mayor Brown in the Washington, D.C. office. David received his BA cum laude from Yale College and his JD from the University of Chicago Law School. But most importantly, David and Lee are co-founders of the Chicago chapter of the Federalist Society, of which they remain extremely active to this day. So Lee and David, thank you so much for being here tonight, and thank you all for joining us on this Tuesday evening. So we're going to go ahead and jump right into the first question. So David and Lee, something that I've always been really extremely interested to know once I heard about this event, and I'm sure many watching are as well. What motivated each of you to get involved and to start what was to become the Chicago chapter of the Federalist Society? Lee, why don't you start, and then David, you can hop right in right after.
Great. Well, when we started it, we didn't know that we were starting the chapter of anything. We thought we were starting a group at Chicago that we ended up calling the Federalist Society because our friend Steve Calabresi, whom we had known in college, was at the same time starting a group at Yale of conservatives and libertarians, and they came up with the name of the Federalist Society. We decided that sounded pretty good, so we swiped it. So we were originally just the University of Chicago Federalist Society without there being a National Federalist Society. The motivation for starting something in Chicago was, in my mind at least, that there were these ideas about law that President Reagan had talked about when he was running for president. And they just were not getting any real discussion on law school campuses, even in Chicago, which was a relatively balanced faculty. There was a lot of discussion of law and economics, but there was really no discussion of what's come to be known as originalism and basically a more disciplined approach to doing law, where you actually take the text of the law seriously. So we didn't know that it was going to be called originalism or textualism at the time, but we knew that there was this problem of judges doing whatever, and that was a problem that deserved discussion. And so that was really, the motivation, I think, at least in my mind, was that this seemed like a serious issue and a serious idea, but it was one that was just being dismissed.
I think Lee's right, Sam. Thank you for hosting this and having us on. It was a desire to bring together people who had similar ideas of how the law should be approached, as Lee mentioned, originalism, and we wanted to get together, talk about it, and encourage our professors to come and meet with us. And I think our first several meetings were lunch meetings with ourselves, and then inviting people to come and debate a topic. I also want to note something Lee mentioned that is a fun comparison to the founding of the country, where at first you had the states, and then you had the Confederation, the Articles of Confederation, then you had the Union. The Federalist Society was a little bit like that, where you had the chapters start here at the University of Chicago and at Yale. Other conservative groups were going at Harvard and Stanford at the time. And it turned out another Federalist Society by somebody we didn't even know at the University of Colorado Law School, Tim Timkovich. And so it was springing up. I think part of the reason for that, by the way, and it was definitely on our mind, was the election of President Reagan. You know, we had started law school in the fall of 1980 and were there when he was elected in that November. And he brought in a very different view of the Constitution and the rule of law. And it inspired us as young law students to take that up as a cause and an issue to talk about. And I think it was happening elsewhere at the same time.
That's so wonderful to hear. I'll have you know, a lot of the events that we currently host now do involve a lot of lunch and a lot of meetings during lunch. So it seems not much has changed on that front. David, as you kind of talked about, there was a lot of different chapters that were popping up left and right. And you also talk about how Professor Calabresi, Lee, that you all knew each other in college. Yeah. How was the coordination amongst all of you and on all of the founders of kind of bringing the union together to kind of form this overarching group?
Yeah, let me mention something that even predated us coming to law school. We were friends at Yale and all spent the summer down in Washington, D.C. doing internships before going to law school. And a good friend of Lee's, really, I think, Steve Galebach, was a recent graduate at Harvard Law School. And he talked about how he missed the camaraderie of getting together with other conservatives. And I think planted that idea with Lee and Steve and me that this would be something to do that would be fun in law school. We had to survive first year, I think, before we actually spent time pulling people together. And so that the idea was planted then, but I think the coordination really started to begin when Steve and Lee, or as my memory, had this idea of let's hold a national conference and invite the leading conservative scholars to come to it. And Lee, you remember some of the things even more than I do about how we were working with the Yale chapter and some of the others.
Yeah. So so the idea so basically, once we had these groups at Yale and Chicago, we came up with the idea of holding a conference, a co-sponsor, that the two groups, which were independent groups at that point, would co-sponsor. I had also we decided that we wanted then Professor Scalia to be our faculty advisor at Chicago. Yeah. But it turned out he was visiting at Stanford at the time. And so I called him up and asked him if he would be our faculty advisor, and he said yes. And he said, oh, and by the way, you might be interested to know there seems to be a group that's gotten started at Stanford. So you might want to be in touch with them about it. And then Human Events ran a story about how conservative groups were starting up at law schools all around the country. Which turned out to mean that in addition to us and Yale and I don't think Human Events knew about Stanford, but they did know about Harvard, which had started before actually either the Yale or the Harvard. I'm sorry, the Yale or the Chicago group started the Harvard. There had been a Harvard Journal for Law and Public Policy, which they started as an alternative law review, and so Human Events referred to that. And so I called up the guy who was the publisher of the Harvard Journal of Law and Public Policy, who turned out to be Spence Abraham. And I said, according to Spence, I actually don't have a clear memory of this, but he says that I told him we're holding this joint conference and it's going to be really important, and you guys should publish the proceedings of it. And so Spence says that he left the phone call and talked to his fellow Harvard organizers of the journal and said, "Hey, I just got this call and it sounds like there's going to be this really important conference and we should publish the proceedings of it." And so they ended up co-sponsoring the conference as well. And so then basically National Review ran a little blurb about the conference in the week section. And we started getting physical letters from students in other schools because there was no internet at the time.
Right.
There was no email, there were no cell phones. So we started getting these physical letters saying, how do we start a chapter of the Federalist Society? Well, there was no National Federalist Society to start a chapter of, but David and I quickly sat down and wrote something about how you start your very own conservative group, and we started sending that out in response. So then we held the conference, and after the conference, we had a business meeting of the groups, the student groups that were represented there, and that's where we decided to start a national organization, and that's how that came about. And the national organization has the full name of the Federalist Society for Law and Public Policy, which takes the Federalist Society obviously from Chicago and Yale, or Yale and Chicago, they would say, with some justification. But the for Law and Public Policy obviously comes in part from Harvard, and it also comes from Stanford, because their group was called the Stanford Foundation for Law and Economic Policy.
It was sort of
That's
one of those, a reprise of the Madisonian compromises. After long debate over what the best name would be, someone mentioned, let's just combine the two and have it be that.
Although I do think that perhaps Yale and Chicago got the better end of that deal, that
Well,
particular deal.
Madison always knew what the better end of his compromises were.
That is so fascinating to hear, although I will like to say Chicago and Yale without any justification at all. But going back to the symposium, as a lot of current members of the Federalist Society at the student division and at the lawyers division look forward to the symposium each and every year. And so I was kind of wondering, what were some of the stories of that original symposium? What went right and what might have not gone right, and kind of had you to adjust on your feet during that first symposium?
Well, Sam, I'll tell you, my roommates at Chicago, we had an apartment off campus, used to tease me that I had a telephone growing out of my ear, one of the old landline phones, because Steve and I and Gary Lawson, who was helping him, and Lee, I was on the phone like 6 hours a day working out logistics for it. So we all arrived at Yale on the day before the conference began. And I think we had advertised that a very generous foundation that Irving Kristol had started gave us some money to give people a few $100s for travel subsidies. But we said, if you need rooms, we can provide them with students on campus, which essentially meant that we were sleeping on somebody's floor. So we grabbed the sleeping bag, rolled it out. Didn't have time for sleep because this was the first time any of us had put on any kind of conference at all. And then the speakers started arriving, and lo and behold, the students started arriving. Everybody, I remember, I think it was the New York Times commented on this, that there were these young law students, all of them wearing ties, that appeared at the Yale for this conference, because it just instinctively, as conservatives, we were going to dress up to be with our professors. We had a lot of fun doing it. We had a banquet that started the tradition of the banquet at the conference. A good friend of ours who was a few years older at Yale, Grover Reese, played folk music on a guitar for the entertainment at that. And we started that tradition of toasts and guitar playing and music that I think eventually got faded out over the years perhaps when Grover stopped coming and none of the rest of us knew how to play the guitar. But it was a fun time and an intellectually stimulating time. And I remember getting no sleep.
Thank goodness we had David because, basically, it turned out that David was the person who kind of had some idea how to organize something like this, especially when the students started arriving and there was not a lot of planning that had gone into what happened when they arrived. So thank goodness we had David.
Oh, that's wonderful to hear. I also love the folk music for the entertainment. That must have been just fantastic. I know that after Yale Symposium, the founders brought the symposium to its rightful place at the University of Chicago. And I was kind of wondering, how much different was the planning? I assume much different than the original, but how was it like hosting an actual symposium versus going to another college for it?
So Lee and Steve, I'm going to return the compliment. They did the intellectual planning for the conference of who to invite and what the topic should be. Lee can say whether that was easier or harder the second time around. Logistically, it was a lot easier to plan one and home base for us at Chicago at that point. And we sort of knew what to expect in terms of how many people and what it would be like to host them. And again, we had a great time. And I'm remembering part of the impetus for doing a second one was some of the letters we received from the professors. Then professors, many of them have gone on to serve as judges and members of the administration, telling us, we really enjoyed this. We didn't really know each other before this. We hope you'll do another one. And that encouraged us to go ahead and organize the second one.
Although I will say after the second one, I do remember thinking, what were we thinking that we wanted to host this? Let's take a break from organizing these things for a little while. And which I think, is probably what happens to students to this day after they've organized one of these. I mean, I think that, there are probably more students involved, who are doing the planning of it. Nonetheless, it is a big enterprise. The size of the enterprise, I'm sure, has grown with the number of students involved. So.
Well, and I'm impressed, Sam, with the amount of preparation the chapters do now. I think Jean and Peter and the leadership have created a little competition for who will get to host the conference. And so the proposals are really sophisticated and they put an enormous amount of thought and work into it, which is great for students everywhere now to be able to come to that.
And I think even though it is exhausting, I think it's a great experience to have done it once. Twice maybe is excessive, but once is good.
I will say this: a few years later, when we were graduates and I think it's 3 or 4 years later, because I was back at the Justice Department by then, Attorney General Meese turned to Lee and Steve and me and said, "You guys are good at organizing a convention." and gave us credit for a full-blown convention when we had thought, okay, wouldn't it be fun to have this conference where we invite some speakers to come to it?
That's absolutely incredible. I mean, I only know how much effort and planning goes into planning just a regular lunch event. I mean, I could not imagine doing an off-the-cuff symposium. I mean, it's absolutely fantastic what it's now become. And Peter is very good at creating competitions, so all the chapters try to do their absolute best for all the proposals.
I hope it's fun too for you.
Oh, it's such a fun time, especially like you said, bringing people together to think on these issues is by far the most rewarding and truly fun aspect of a lot of the events that the Federalist Society puts on and the student chapters put on.
And Sam, that reminds me of something that we really thought about at the beginning of the first conference, the chapters we set up, we decided very intentionally not to become an advocacy group, but we have a point of view that we all, and that varies, but to set it up as a debating society so that you could have different views presented and encourage the students to engage in that debate and the thoughtfulness. Now, I have to admit, part of my bias was that if equally presented, the beliefs I had about the Constitution and being an ordered liberty and originalism would prevail. So I was pretty confident that we had a good chance of winning those debates, but it made it much more interesting. And I found a lot of my classmates who weren't particularly conservatives would come and listen to a debate more than a speaker. And so we really very consciously decided that. Later, and as we grew as an organization, it became tempting to become an advocacy group. And we had to reaffirm that real commitment to debate.
I completely agree. Back when you were hosting these debates and these events, do any debates specifically kind of stick out in your mind as being just extremely exciting and fun and interesting back when you were first starting out with these different events?
I mean, I remember a great debate between was it Graglia and Epstein about freedom of speech? I think
Yeah.
it might have been.
I think it
Graglia
was.
from the University of Texas. I think that was at Stanford at the Stanford Symposium.
Yeah.
There were also some pretty good debates between Epstein and Scalia about exactly how what the role of the courts is in enforcing, for example, the takings clause or related things.
I can only imagine a debate between Scalia and Epstein. That sounds, I feel like everyone in this audience's dream to be able to see something of that nature.
Yeah, they were fantastic. Little less on the sublime, but one of the things that came out of that meeting that Lee described after the conference at Yale, where we agreed to form a national organization, was the decision to have Madison be kind of our hero, our emblem, or I wouldn't quite say mascot, but and we decided to make his bust very much part of the brand of the Federalist Society, and in fact later developed our own ties and apparel that we enjoy wearing, but none of us knew how to make a profile. And so we turned to Judge Bork's younger son, Charles, who was a friend, and said, can you design for us the bust of Madison? And a few months later, I forget where we were. Do you remember that, Lee, where Charles came and showed it to us?
I don't remember.
And we loved it. It looked great. A couple of years later, he confided in a sort of a solce voce whisper, it looks good because I had to do a nose job on him. And Madison's actual profile is not quite as handsome as the Federalist Society version. But those are the things that you have fun doing when you start these things.
Yeah, we also, I think this is worth mentioning, at that same business meeting, we adopted the statement of principles that, is still the statement of principles to this day, which of course refers to and builds on Chief Justice Marshall's statement that is emphatically the province of and duty of the judiciary to say what the law is, and then we added not what it should be. I think that turns out to be, I think, that's stood the test of time pretty well, I think, actually, the statement of principles.
Oh, I completely agree. I think the not what it should be line is something that at least I think most members of the Chicago chapter have repeated to me incessantly and to many of our classmates at the University of Chicago, whether it be constitutional law, common law 1, 2, or 3. So it definitely has withstood the test of time. You mentioned that you had asked Justice Scalia to be the faculty advisor, and I know how important professors and academics really are at the school. I was kind of wondering, what was it like to have Scalia as a mentor, and were there other academic or administration or professors that were mentors to you during the founding of the chapter?
So, in terms of you know, just how to get things up and running, I think for Chicago, then Professor Scalia was probably the most important, because he knew you know he knew a lot of people, and he had a sense of what people were good at, and he also, as David mentioned, helped us raise some initial money, which was fairly indispensable to being able to do anything. Yeah, but there were certainly other professors at Chicago who were very important, both in terms of the ideas. I mean, Scalia was important for the ideas also. I mean, his notion of the separation of powers and of the role of the structure of the Constitution, I think, was quite foundational. But I would say that second most important, and I don't even want to rank them, actually, because I mean, in terms of the ideas, Richard Epstein was also extremely important, because he just had this vision of how everything in law fits together. And at least for me, that was really very formative, in terms of just thinking about, the whole seamless web of law, if you will, and kind of the role of property and the role of contracts and the role of torts and things like that. So, and the importance of Roman law, which I'm
Yeah.
sure David and I took the Roman law seminar.
Or
So
he did wrap it all together.
yes, 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 yeah.
Everything always comes
But
back.
I mean, Frank Easterbrook and was also, I think,
Yeah.
an important figure in terms of the law and economics side of things, and Posner also, actually, in terms of the law and
Yeah.
economics side of things. I mean, I think Posner had. I mean, it is very useful to think of um trade-offs, and and not think, hey, we're going to do this good thing, and we're going to, that's not going to have any unintended consequences. um Very important to be aware of the problems with that way of thinking about the world, and I do think that the law and economics folks were very valuable for that purpose.
Yeah, and certainly for me and the rest of my career, that whole learning those economic concepts at their high level, and mingled with, mixed into the law, shaped to the way I thought about things for the rest of my life. Um, there were some really important folks at Yale as well. Ralph Winter was on the faculty. I think he was their initial faculty advisor. And Judge Bork came from the Yale Law faculty at that point and was very helpful to us also. So and we had mentioned Graulia, Texas. There were people around the country that enjoyed the Federalist Society conferences and later helped us and mentored young people who are starting chapters at their law school.
Yeah. And later, of course, also, after we graduated, we got to know uh the whole Meese Justice Department team,
Yeah.
and they were also, extremely important in helping the society grow beyond being a student organization, which was terrific. Obviously, to also being an organization of lawyers and professionals.
We have time for about one more question on my end. So everyone, please use the Q&A box, and you can type in your questions, or you feel free to raise your yellow hand and I can call on you. But we will get to those questions in just one moment. For the final question for each of you, the Federalist Society has enjoyed 40 years of such amazing growth and has done so many things for so many people to further people's time in law school, their legal careers, and really the way a lot of us think about the law. What do you hope to see in the next 40 years of the Federalist Society? What do you hope kind of blossoms in these next 40 years? So at the 80th anniversary, we can look back on some wonderful developments.
Well, I guess I'm hoping, I think that at the moment we have a big division in the country about what exactly law is supposed to do. I mean, which is, different in a way from, or significantly different from what the situation was when David and I started law school, because there wasn't really division, because there was, kind of this view that it was whatever judges thought was a good idea. I mean, I'm oversimplifying, I'm sure, but I think we do have a lot of division about it now, and I'm hoping that we're able to persuade people that you know that we have the right ideas, I guess, and that it becomes, not only the view among conservatives that there is this law that exists that's independent of politics, but also that that people on the left come around to thinking that might be the case, because I think it's not a healthy situation to have this much division about that question.
Agree completely with Lee, and I'm hoping that some of the graduates in law school today and in the coming years will rise to be leaders, not only in the judiciary, but also throughout our society, throughout the rest of government. I would say my fondest hope and dream is, and a little bit of this is preservation, but that we will be one of the leading advocates for debate and free speech, and that idea will also be once again reaffirmed by left and right in the country, because I think it's essential to a democratic government. It's essential to a healthy society that you can debate and observe and inquire into facts. And recently, we've seen so many efforts to silence debate, either about the epidemic that we had, the facts and coming out of that, or political debate. Certain ideas are beyond discussion. If you say them, you're canceled from public square, and that's simply unhealthy for everyone in the society. And so my dream would be 40 years from now, we're this bright shining forum for debate of all types in the law, and that other people have copied it in other areas in society and said, yeah, debate is a good thing.
And it's going to fall to you guys. I mean,
Yeah.
and it somewhat has already, of course, obviously. I mean, we may have come up with a good idea, but it wouldn't have been nearly as good an idea if there hadn't been people at all these law schools, who've taken it and run with it. And so, at the end of the day, we can have whatever hopes and dreams we have, but it's going to be in your hands to decide how this goes.
Yeah, I think many of us are excited to take on that role. And so we have a few Q&A questions that have come in, and two of them kind of go to what we were just talking about. And what advice would you give to current law students that might be facing some of this cancellation or backlash, and what advice would you have for them to step past it and to move on in their time at law school and with their legal career?
Yeah, so I mean, I will say, I don't think that we had at Chicago's, always been a strong place for freedom of speech, as long as I've been associated with it. And so David and I didn't have these kinds of challenges when we were starting the Chicago group. I think that the students at a number of the other schools did have, fairly serious challenges. I mean, it's not like we were universally popular with our classmates, don't get me wrong. One of them, for example, suggested that he hoped I broke a leg as I was going to the polls, but I think it was, intended as a joke, more or less anyway. Um, but but I don't think we had really serious problems. But there were serious problems. I remember that mostly at most notably at Harvard, where the faculty where the critical legal studies faculty members, when we held the symposium there, were encouraging students to boycott it and telling people they might not be well advised to go to it because it might reflect poorly on them and things like that. So there was some of this kind of cancel culture rumblings in the air even back then. I think the thing that's changed, that's gotten very difficult to deal with, is the idea that um, if someone else is bothered by what I say, that person has been harmed, and that harm rises to the same level as physical harm, at least, if not more. That's kind of a new invention of the last five. Well, it may have been started before the last 5 years, but it's really become prominent in the last 5 years. And I think it's important, even in your own mind, not to buy that argument. I mean, to be sure, people prefer being agreed with to not being agreed with, but that's not necessarily was good for them in the long term. And so I think it is important not to internalize that. That's sort of, thing number one. Thing number two, nonetheless, we've tried to make a point of making our ideas heard civilly and intelligently and reasonably. And I think that that is a good approach. I think it's an even more important approach in the current climate where we have all of this social media way of interacting with people, which, is not particularly healthy. So, I think uh I do think that the kind of the way we've been approaching trying to be heard is basically a good strategy as well as being a good idea.
And I agree completely with Lee on that. I would add two kind of additional things. One, just be confident that there is truth in the world, and seek that truth. We have to recognize we don't know it all, but there is truth, and don't shy away from that when you find it. Don't let anybody intimidate you into that. But then second, I find asking questions is a good way to debate. And in part, what that tells the other person or the other side is, I want to try to understand how you're thinking, how you're approaching this, even if we disagree. It makes them more open to listen to what I have to say. So ask a lot of questions of your opponents.
Well, in the spirit of 40 for 40, we were trying to aim to end at 8:40, so we were right on the dot. David and Lee, thank you both so much for not only joining this webinar tonight, but for the bravery, hard work, and determination that you showed 40 years ago to allow law students like me and law students that I know are watching tonight to revolutionize the way that we look at law. I know that I would not be sitting here right now without the Federalist Society. So thank you so much for coming tonight, but more importantly, thank you so much for all that you've done for the chapter over these past 40 years.
Thank you all very much. Thank you so much, Sam, for hosting this too.
Yes, thank you, Sam, for carrying it on. As Lee
Yeah.
pointed out, it's your Federalist Society and your generation's Federalist Society that will make the difference in the future.
And thank you all for joining us tonight. Please join us next week as we host the Harvard Founders Talk on October 25th, just a week away. Thank you, everybody, for coming, and have a great rest of your evening.